Some events change history not because of what happened, but because of how they were told. On May 7, 1915, the British passenger liner Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, including American citizens. The outrage was imminent, the headlines were unmistakable, the moral framing was absolute. Germany, the public was told, had crossed a line. But according to Prolonging the Agony, the sinking of the Lusitania was not simply a wartime tragedy. It was a narrative turning point. This episode explains what the public was shown, what was quietly omitted, and how outrage itself became a strategic asset. Why was the Lusitania sailing through a declared war zone? What was it carrying? And why did the story that reached the public leave so little room for those questions? Chapters 13 and 14 argue that the power of the Lusitania lie not only in its sinking, but in how that sinking was framed, amplified, and preserved, not as an accident of war, but as a moral weapon. Chapter 13, Lusitania, Lost in a Fog of Lies. Chapter 13 challenges the popular story of the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, arguing that it was not an unforeseen tragedy, but a managed crisis shaped by intelligence, deception, and political calculation. By early 1915, British naval intelligence had broken Germany's secret naval codes. Through a highly secret unit known as Room 40, the Admiralty could intercept and monitor German U-boat communications. At the same time, Lusitania, built with government funding to Admiralty specifications, was regularly carrying munitions from the United States to Britain, supplied through major American financial and industrial networks. German warnings that British passenger lines were transporting armaments were publicly dismissed as propaganda, yet later discoveries, including a suppressed cargo manifest, confirmed that Lusitania was indeed carrying large quantities of military material. American authorities, including Woodrow Wilson, were presented with evidence of these shipments but took no action to halt them. Despite clear warnings about German submarine operations, Lusitania was allowed to sail into a declared war zone without a destroyer escort, even though she had received protection on previous voyages. The authors argue this decision was deliberate. British leaders privately discussed the political impact that the sinking of an American-linked liner would have on U.S. public opinion. On May 7, 1915, Lusitania was struck by a single torpedo fired by U-20. A second explosion followed, likely internal, but the Admiralty claimed multiple torpedo hits. Nearly 1,200 people died, including over 100 Americans. In the aftermath, attention shifted from responsibility to damage control. Captain Turner was targeted and blamed through a highly biased inquiry, while contradictory evidence was ignored. The legal proceedings collapsed under scrutiny. But by then, the narrative had already taken hold. The chapter concludes that Lusitania's sinking was not simply a wartime atrocity, but a political turning point engineered through secrecy and sacrifice, helping shift American opinion towards eventual entry into the war. Chapter 13 argues that the Lusitania was not just sunk, it was used. Chapter 14, Lusitania, Protecting the Guilty. Chapter 14 argues that the aftermath of the Lusitania sinking was defined by swift coordination to protect those responsible. According to the authors, powerful interests on both sides of the Atlantic closed ranks to suppress evidence and preserve the official narrative. At the center was J.P. Morgan's financial empire, which played a leading role in supplying arms to the Allies while the United States publicly claimed neutrality. Through control of major shipping interests, Morgan's network exercised enormous influence over wartime trade, and British shipping companies benefited directly from this arrangement. Despite German claims that Lusitania carried munitions, U.S. authorities repeatedly denied it. On the docks, American officials approved shipments bound for Allied nations, while government departments dismissed or buried contradictory evidence. When William Jennings Bryan resigned in June 1915, His letter implicitly acknowledged the truth. American passenger ships were routinely carrying ammunition, and the government knew it. Survivor testimonies were ignored or lost, affidavits disappeared, and inconvenient facts were denied, even when later evidence confirmed them. The authors contend that this successful joint cover-up shielded financial and political elites from accountability while reframing the tragedy for public consumption. The chapter concludes that protecting the guilty mattered more than exposing the truth. By controlling the story of the Lusitania, British and American leaders helped shift U.S. public opinion towards war, not through transparency, but through suppression. Chapter 14 argues that the real operation after the Lusitania sank was not rescue, but concealment. The sinking of the Lusitania is remembered as a moral turning point. An innocent ship, innocent passengers, a line crossed. But chapters 13 and 14 of Prolonging the Agony argue that history hardened far too quickly around a single version of events. According to the book, the true power of the Lusitania lay not only in its destruction, but in what followed. What was emphasized, what was excluded, and how outrage itself became a strategic resource. The tragedy was real, the suffering was real, but the story was shaped. Warnings issued before the voyage faded from memory. Questions about cargo were dismissed. Context dissolved under moral certainty. And one outrage had taken hold. Nuance no longer mattered. War does not require unanimity, only momentum. The Lusitania did not immediately bring the United States into the war, but it changed the conditions under which the war could later be justified. Public opinion shifted, moral boundaries hardened, alternatives narrowed. After the Lusitania, neutrality became harder to defend, not because facts disappeared, but because outrage made them irrelevant. This was not the end of the war, but it was a decisive step towards widening it. If the Lusitania shows how outrage is manufactured, the next episode shows how it is sustained, because once war is sold morally, it no longer needs proof, only repetition.